Shock absorbers are another detail item on model trucks that are easy to scratch build from basic materials and add greatly to the appearance of the finished model. The shocks in AMT's American LaFrance kits are a little bit strange. The front shocks are designed to clip onto the axle beam as shown here. I've never seen a 1-to-1 scale shock absorber with this style of claw fitting, but I believe the intent was to recreate this appearance, where the lower mounting point for the shock is part of the bracket where the axle attaches to the spring pack. I represented this in model form with a short piece of 40 thou styrene rod glued to the bottom of the spring pack. To build the upper shock mounting point, I started with a square piece of 20 thou by 156 styrene strip and marked the center of the piece. A 1/16 hole was drilled in the center and the corners were rounded off. A short piece of styrene rod, 1/16 diameter, was glued in place and left extra long for final trimming after assembly. The short projection on the back side of the bracket is glued in place in the hole provided in the frame rail where the kit shock would have attached. 4 styrene rivet heads were added to represent fasteners holding the bracket to the frame. Now we can make the shock absorbers themselves. I like to use 1/8 brass tube for the main body of the shock, with 332 tube for the crosser at the top. For the lower piece, I use 332 styrene tube, and the bottom mounting eye is also 332 tube, sliced off 1/16 long, and glued in place crosswise on the end of the bottom piece of the shock as shown here. Building the upper half of the shock from brass tube requires soldering, and this little hobby vise has worked really well for me for many years. These 2 slots are excellent for holding tube, and here I have one of the 1/8 pieces clamped in place so that I can use a round file to coat the top of the tube to positively locate the small piece of 3/32 tube, which will be soldered in place. When soldering, it's important that all the surfaces be clean, and to help with this process, paste flux is applied to the areas which will be soldered. The 332 tube is set in place. And I apply some pressure with tweezers to hold it, while solder is applied with the soldering gun. And then I keep holding it as the solder cools. Do any required final trim and cleanup on the brass part, then assemble the top and bottom halves of the shock and slide into place on the mounting pins. Because the top and bottom halves of the shock are separate pieces, they telescope just like a real shock, making installation very easy. Trim the excess length of the mounting pins off. And add styrene disc washers and nut and bolt casting for fasteners to complete the installation. A more realistic installation than the stock kit parts. Drive axle shocks on the AMT's American LaFrance kit are also unusual. One end is supposed to attach to these notches in the crossmember, and the other end is supposed to be glued into holes in the axle. Here are the stock kit shocks for the American LaFrance. The parting line is quite obvious, and that's another reason why I like to scratch build these parts in many cases. It may seem like more work at the outset, but I find it's often easier than trying to clean up parting lines in Flash and keep the parts perfectly round. I'll admit to some degree of freelancing on the rear shock installation on this model, using 40 thou by 100 thou wide styrene strip and 1/16 styrene rod to make the frame mounts for the shocks, and 1/8 inch square styrene tube to make brackets that will attach the bottom of the shock to the axle. I cut one side out of the tube to form a channel, and the track cutting pliers work very well for this to make the initial rough cut. One bracket here in its rough cut state, and the other one filed and cleaned up with the corners rounded slightly. Here's the parts for both shock absorbers. Again, the upper part is made from 1/8 inch brass tube for the main body, and 332 brass tube soldered in place for the top mounting eye. The frame brackets are glued in place first. I also used a piece of 100th styrene angle to overlay the crossmember and cover up the two notches. Slide the upper portion of the shocks onto the mounting pins. Then install the lower half of the shock and glue their mounting brackets to the axle. Finish by adding the usual styrene disc washer, along with styrene nut and bolt castings and bolt heads as required to represent the fasteners. A lot of these details might seem like they're hidden away underneath the truck, but from the right viewing angle, they're highly visible and improve the appearance of the finished model. One additional example is on a Transtar 4300 conventional. Here I've reworked the spring and axle attachment points with scratch-built parts, including the spacer block between the spring and the axle. I used a short piece of 332 tube with 40th styrene rod glued into it for the mounting point for the bottom of the shock, and on the frame, the kit has nicely molded bracket detail. I simply added a piece of 1/16 styrene rod to this for the upper attachment point. These are the shock absorbers for this model, and in the middle is one that I made using styrene tube for both the upper and lower portions to show the difference in wall thickness. The overall appearance is still good, so if soldering is not feasible, styrene tube is an excellent alternative. Again, the upper and lower halves are slipped together and then slid onto the mounting pins. Trim the mounting pins to length and finish with styrene disc washers and nut and bolt castings to represent the fasteners. I use a lot of 10 thou black styrene sheet to make the discs for various applications, and it shows up well in the videos and photos, but it's also very handy when building the model at the bench to help line things up because of the contrast between the typically white or light gray styrene on most model kits. And finishing with a view of the opposite side of the same model from a different viewing angle. Some truck kits don't come with shock absorbers. A couple of examples that come to mind are AMT's Ford Louisville and their White-Freightliners, of which the instruction sheet of the SD model is pictured here. No front shock absorbers in sight, although the real White-Freightliners had them, so being able to scratch build shock absorbers makes them easy to add to your model. This one also has steps that look very much like the ones provided in AMT's kit. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of this installment. Shock absorbers are an easy item to scratch build using basic materials and are a worthwhile addition to your next model project.